Our daughter Jessie loves playing detective.
A clue.
But since we discovered she has sensitive skin, we've been playing detective too.
We thought the problem was our puppy.
But it was actually our old detergent.
Aha.
So we switched to Tide Free and Gentle. Tide cleans better than the leading competitive free detergent, and it doesn't leave behind irritating residues.
Plus, Tide Free and Gentle has no dyes or perfumes, so it's gentle on her skin.
Case closed.
If it's got to be clean, it's got to be Tide Free and Gentle.
You can put some change in a stranger's parking meter. Don't pick up your phone inside the movie theater. But there's one thing that'll help you the most. It's giving blood while you relax and read the Morning Post. Good karma by the pint. Give blood. Donate blood and then you just might save 3 people's lives and get a season's worth of good vibes.
Visit Memorial Blood Centers to get your good karma by the pint.
Why has there been such a change in the literacy of our students? That's right. The percentage of students reading outside of school has plummeted, with only 14% of 13-year-olds reporting reading for fun. Why is this happening, and why is it a problem? Joining us on the John Schuster Coldwell Banker Hotline is Deborah Sundal. She's the executive officer for the Groves Literacy Partnership. Deborah, thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So is this trend of kids reading less consistent with life as we know it since the 50s or the invention of the television, or has this taken a major plunge during COVID?
Well, I think there's always a both and, right? As there are many things keeping our kids' attention these days. But I'd like to actually go back because I think there's a root cause. And that root cause is that literacy rates in the United States are at an all-time low, which means that when something is hard to do, usually you don't do it. And so I think we really need to look at the systems issue of why since the 1980s have fewer and fewer kids been able to read at grade level.
So what's the answer to that?
Well, I think we need to look in. I wish there was a magic bullet,
right.
And unfortunately there's not. And so we've had a lot of people in the educational system been looking at why the system break down. And what we know is from places like the National Reading Panel that issued a final report 24 years ago, back in 2000, so well before the pandemic. And what we found is that 4 things were happening. So first of all, our instruction took a major shift in the 1980s, and we didn't have focus on phonics, and we shifted towards whole language, which means that kids weren't getting those fundamental skills of how do you decode a word when you come to one that's challenging? What are those approaches of how you know what it is? Second of all, the teacher training that has occurred since the 1980s, which included my teacher training, didn't prepare us for evidence-based literacy instruction. So we definitely taught the love of reading, but not those foundational skills, which we are now realize after decades are so critical. 3, there were resource inequalities, and then also there's a huge proportion of kids who may have a reading disability, and those go largely undiagnosed.
Deborah, can you explain to us, and I know this is a big question, and yeah, it's only a 3-hour show, so maybe you won't have enough time, but the difference between the Hooked on Phonics, which is, I grew up in the 80s and Adam did, and we learned how to read phonetically, and this whole language learning. I know that's a big question, and I've listened to many podcasts about it, but can you explain to our listeners the difference between whole language learning and phonics?
Well, really, I agree. That's a huge question. And sometimes analogies work well. So when we think about what does it take to read, there are so many skills that go into that. And it's very similar to what does it take to learn to play the piano. And so what we did is in the 80s, we focused on that love of literacy, the immersive experience. We focused on the comprehension pieces. And we said, well, phonics is sometimes kids don't feel engaged there. So let's do less of it. And we actually now know that was a mistake, is that kids need both. So the analogy is this. Imagine trying to learn to play the piano, and the only way you learn to play the piano is by listening to people playing. And you're never taught what the notes mean. Some kids will learn to play the piano, but many will not. And that was, in essence, what happened with whole language. We had a great emphasis on the love of literacy, but we failed to teach the fundamental skills, and it led to the outcomes today. And the outcomes today are pretty staggering. So some of the listeners may not know this, but there is an organization called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. And what they found in 2022, so right after the pandemic, was that in our nation, only 33% of fourth grade students can read at grade level. Jeez. And so when you look at that, only 1/3. And so this is a huge systematic issue for our nation and also for our state.
We are talking to Deborah Sundal, Executive Director or Executive Officer for Grove's Literary Partnerships, about this. What is a crisis? I think we can call it a crisis in illiteracy. Yes. Is this a uniquely American problem, Deborah, or are other countries seeing this?
I think it goes back to how are students taught. And so, again, very much there are scientific ways, and we research those ways that are the best ways to teach kids to learn. And so if a nation is teaching, no matter the language, with all of the fundamental skills necessary to learn to read, so which includes the foundational skills, but also the comprehension skills, and that all weaves together. What you get in the outcome are people who are proficient in reading. They can enjoy it, but they also can decode. So nations that teach with a method that includes both have strong readers. If there are countries that have taught in different ways, they too may be struggling with the reading outcomes.
So why aren't we doing this? It seems like this is a crisis. We understand there's a problem. Why aren't we making sweeping changes to our educational system?
We at Grove's Learning Organization, we are a part of this change. And what I love about being a part of this organization is we have been at this work for 51 years. Recognizing that not all kids learn to read in the same way. Mm-hmm. And so those sweeping changes, right, any time that we have 30 to 40 years of doing something that could be improved upon, we also need to take a system-based approach to improving it. And so what you'll see, we have some highlights of states that have been doing this longer than the state of Minnesota. So again, I referenced the National Reading Panel. They came out with their report in 2000, and Mississippi in 2013 was the first state to say, we're going to take these recommendations and implement them into our state practices. And if you look at the reading outcomes of Mississippi, they've largely improved over the years. In 2023, Minnesota was one of 17 states that said, yes, it's our turn too. We are going to set policy on how reading should be taught in our state. And so we are 1 year into this journey, and what we see is 4 fundamental things need to occur. One, we need to acknowledge that this is not about individual teachers. This is about a system breakdown. And we need to start with professional learning. So again, keep in mind that many teachers have graduated without learning about the science of reading. So we start with professional learning. Then the next step is how do we give educators and districts tools, curriculum, materials that align to the science of reading, that give them both foundational skills and comprehension. And we do that as a practical application in our classrooms, in our students' classrooms. 3, we know that any big change can't simply be done with education and a book, but oftentimes we need coaching. And so there are coaching programs where people who are experts are going in and walking alongside educators, helping them, because not all kids learn alike, and they're helping them and saying, okay, let's modify here and here. And then finally, the fourth part, which is so critical, is data and outcomes, measuring how we are doing. And so what that looks like is it could be unit-based assessments where we say, I taught this, but this student isn't yet catching on. So what type of intervention in a small group can we do so that every student learns those skills? And then we look at our national outcomes that says not just in kindergarten or first grade, but what is that learning trajectory for our child or our students, and what that looks like all the way from kindergarten to the end of third grade. And so that type of systems-based approach, where we're looking at professional development, curriculum, coaching, and outcomes, is the way that we change our outcomes here in the nation and also here in Minnesota.
Deborah, how many school districts in Minnesota roughly are accepting this and changing the way they teach reading based on going back to the phonics method?
Because of the Reading Act, every single district and every independent school and charter school across our state is asking themselves that question. And so that's the beauty of policy change, is we get common language on what are the next steps we should take. And I would say every district is on their own journey, and we have the privilege to partner with over 600 educators in the state of Minnesota. And we are partnering with over 100 schools. And here's what we know on a day-to-day basis. They are asking the questions. They are bringing in new types of curriculum that teach to this method. And not all districts have the same access to resources. Not all districts are starting at the same place. So I would say every single school and every single district is on a unique journey. And we're aligned with the policy, this new updated policy that we've been given.
Deborah, what do you say to folks that say, "Oh, it's the phones and the iPads. It's all the technology and it's all the social media. That's why kids aren't reading"?
You know, I have kids, and right, as I put on my parent hat, that seems logical, right? And I would ask the question too, of that could be a contributing factor, but is it the reason? And I would say, right, none of us love to do something that we're not good at. Yep. And so if it's easier to pick up a phone and a tablet and have something read to you versus figuring out, well, what does that consonant, vowel, consonant sounds do, and what does that look like if we haven't been given the tools? Most of us will pick the easier path. And so, yes, phones are a contributing factor, but they're not the reason. And so what I would say is we have to go all the way back to the beginning to say what are the fundamental skills that our students need. And I would say that I'm with you, that this is grave because it is not, we believe at Groves that reading is a fundamental right. And those are pretty big words, but here's why we believe that. We understand the long-term impact. So a child who is not proficient in reading by the end of fourth grade is 4 times more likely not to graduate from high school. And if you don't graduate, there's downstream effect. Job readiness is impacted. There's evidence of lower lifetime earning. People have poorer health outcomes who can't read. There's perpetual cycles of poverty, and quality of life is significantly impacted. And, you know, as Minnesotans, we really pride ourselves in education, but we have a crisis that also impacts our disparities in socioeconomics. And so this is a statistic that just takes us even further. So if you are a student who has lower access to resources, your reading proficiency rates at fourth grade are 20%. If you are in a higher access to resources or higher SES, your reading rates at fourth grade are 76%. So this is really about, we can tie things to the tablets and technology, but I think we have to take as a state a much deeper look of if we want a state that has students who are ready for jobs and lifetime of great health outcomes, we really need to go all the way back to the beginning.
I I know
Go
we're
ahead,
out of
George.
time, Adam.
Yep.
Deb, can I just sneak in one more question, Deborah? Because you talk about access to resources. We're talking about fourth graders and under here. Don't all these kids have the same access to resources because they're in public schools? They have a kindergarten teacher, a first grade teacher, a second grade teacher. You know, when they're in school, they're all on an equal footing. So when you talk about access to resources, what other resources would they have than public school?
Yeah, not all schools are funded in the same ways. And so, whether or not a school district has access to resources for additional professional development, et cetera. So I'd say, yes, everyone has access to schools, but those schools' experiences can be very different depending on where you live in our state. And so that professional development, what type of budget does the school district have to buy resources? And so before we end, I know there's a lot of parents out there saying these statistics are horrible and what can I do for my child? And just my encouragement is to engage. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing at Groves Learning Organization, our website is www.groveslearning.org. And we have so many resources for parents, and we've got family navigators who can help families navigate their own journey in literacy. And I just go to our page if your child is struggling, because I know it is a heartache if you see your child struggling to read.
Deborah, we could do 2 hours with you with so many more questions. We'll reach out again and talk to you, and hopefully we can bring some better news as we move along here. But thank you so much for the expertise and the deep dive in this, and we'll have you on again. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks.
Deborah Sundal, Executive Officer for Groves Literary Partnerships.